Okay. So what we have here is the slide we finished on yesterday. We're in the process of going through the, I think it's 8 contemporary perspectives in psychology today. Now basically what this means is, again, if you were to run into a psychologist and ask them, what their specialty was, they'll give you one of the 20 or 30 specialties that we'll see on the slide coming up. But what this also then stresses is what their basic orientation is in doing their work. As I told you yesterday, I would describe myself as being a cognitive behavioral clinical psychologist, which means with some clients I would stress this cognitive perspective, so I would work with them on their thought processes, their attitudes, their beliefs, how they view the world. Other clients I would perhaps work more with a behavioral perspective. Again, a good example there would be working with parents who are having behavior management issues with their child. So there I would be stressing the correct use of things like positive and negative reinforcement and punishment with their child to try to modify their child's behavior. Okay? Any questions on that idea of a perspective? And then for your benefit, what you'll see on the exam next week, I'm sure, is at least 1 or 2 questions where I will describe a psychologist's approach to the field and then ask you to tell me which of the 8 perspectives they subscribe to. Okay? All right. Another new perspective in psychology, and this has pretty much come out because of the shrinking nature of the globe. That is, we travel and we concern ourselves much more with cultures all over the world. We need to take a cross-cultural perspective today. And as I said there, it's more contemporary, emerged in the 1980s. And what it does is emphasize the diversity of behavior across cultures and the fact that many earlier psychological findings were not universal. We used to be so naive that we thought that every research finding that we discovered applied to everybody at any time. That means universal. And we found out that wasn't the case. And one of the primary ways we found that out was with a phenomenon called social loafing. Does anybody want to take a shot at what social loafing is? You know what loafing is. That means just kind of slacking off, not putting as much effort forth. Social loafing means we behave differently when we're operating alone as an individual than when we're operating as part of a group. Now what the initial finding was when we did this research in America was that, well, let me ask you, do you think people in our country work harder when they're working on their own or when they're working in a group? On their own, exactly, yeah. We are, you see down, let me jump ahead for an instant here. Down below here, you see the different categories of cultures, individualistic cultures and collectivistic cultures. We are an individualistic culture in that we emphasize the needs and the goals of the individual over the needs and the goals of the group. And that means, again, most of the time, and none of these are true 100% of the time. Okay, you always have exceptions. But in most Western cultures, we've found that when people are working on their own, they work harder. Okay? For instance, one of the things I've heard, from people over the years, especially when they're working on a group project, is that if they sense that somebody else in the group isn't working as hard as them, it discourages them. So they back off. We also know that when we succeed, when we're working on our own, we get all of the accolades, we get all of the rewards, so to speak, and that tends to make us work hard. Well, when they took that initial study and they duplicated it or replicated it in China, they found just the opposite, that people tended to work harder there when they were in a group. Because China, Japan, most Eastern cultures and a lot of Hispanic cultures tend to be what we have down here, collectivistic cultures. And they tend to emphasize the needs and the goals of the group, the family, the neighborhood, the company, over the needs and the goals of the individual. Okay, so we don't get that social loafing finding in all cultures. So as a result, we have to take a cross-cultural perspective. You have to take into consideration where the person lives, where they have grown up, because that culture has influenced their attitudes, their values, and their beliefs. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Another term you have up here that I like to stress, and you should be aware of it, is ethnocentrism. Okay? And as I have up here, that's the belief that one's own culture or ethnic group is superior to all others. And then we tend to use our own culture as the standard by which to judge other cultures. Okay? You see a lot of this in our country, unfortunately. Sometimes you hear the phrase American exceptionalism, and that tends to communicate this idea of ethnocentrism, that the way we do things is always the best way to do it. And the fact of the matter is, and this is not being un-American or non-patriotic, but just the fact of the matter is, the way we do things is not always the best way. We could serve to learn some things from other cultures sometimes. Okay? So the plea here is to you, to people, not to be ethnocentric. Don't think we're always the best. We're the standard to compare everybody else. We're just different. Everybody's different. Okay? Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay, this is a slide that kind of communicates that idea of cultural differences. You see here, this happens to be a picture from Tokyo and their subway system, and you see people cramming into a subway car, which again is not that different from a subway, I'm guessing, in New York City. But the difference here is in Tokyo, they actually have people whose job it is to cram people into the subway car. You see these guys in uniforms with white gloves on, pushing people into the car. Okay? And I have the question here, how do you think Americans would react to being shoved into a subway car?
Personally?
Yeah. Well, how would they react?
They would react, personally, like, this is not right.
It's not cool. Okay? Take your hands off me. Don't, you're violating my personal space here. And that reflects a cultural attitude. Okay? That's the point here. Everyday behavior reflects cultural norms or unspoken standards. So what would work in one country wouldn't necessarily work in another country. Okay? Any questions? And this is why, and again, that idea of the globe shrinking, with so many businesses today being international in their focus, when a company, for instance, just in the news recently, that Mead Johnson, the pharmaceutical company in Evansville that makes infant formula, is being bought out by a British company. So that means, there's going to be more travel by people from Mead Johnson in Evansville to other countries in the world. When we send our executives over to other countries to do business, we have to give them primers, little courses in what is culturally acceptable, socially acceptable in the country that they're going to visit, because we don't want them to offend anybody in this new country. Okay? Any questions? Okay. The last perspective that we talk about here is the evolutionary perspective. And we haven't specifically talked about this, but it's very similar to William James's school of thinking of functionalism, where he took Darwin's work into consideration and always asked the question, how does this behavior in a person help them function or adapt to their environment? So the evolutionary perspective reflects interest in Darwin's work, applies the principles of evolution to explain psychological processes, and suggests that most adaptive characteristics of people, things that help us function, include behaviors that are perpetuated, that stay with us through the process of natural selection, which is what Darwin talked about. Behaviors, characteristics that help the species survive tend to stay in the species and get passed on from generation to generation. We'll talk about this in chapter 5 when we talk about learning, and when we talk about phobias. What's a phobia?
Something that a person is like scared of.
Right, it's an extreme fear.
Irrational. Extreme.
Exactly, specific. Very good point. It's an irrational fear of something. Now, when you think of phobias in people, what are some of the more common phobias you think of?
Height.
Height, acrophobia. Small rooms, claustrophobia. Yes, Gretchen.
Water.
Water, okay. Hydrophobia. Yes.
Spiders.
Spiders.
The dark.
The dark, okay. Sometimes snakes, okay. Now, the interesting thing about all of those things that we just described, at one time, or presently, or at one time in our evolution, they were significant threats to us. If you walked up to every snake you encountered, or every spider you encountered, or if you walked over to the cusp of every high cliff that you encountered, you could die, okay? It could be bad for you, and it could keep you from surviving and passing on your genes to later generations. So what we think is happening, so you say, okay, why today are a lot of us afraid of those things, when really, although it's bad, certainly to be bitten by a poisonous spider or bitten by a poisonous snake, it doesn't happen all that frequently in our society. But it seems to be biologically built into some of us to be afraid of heights, snakes, spiders, closed-in places, the dark. And what we think that means is our forebears, our predecessors, who, when we were living out in the wild, who had a healthy fear of heights and snakes and spiders, they were the ones more likely to survive than the ones who just walked up to the edge of the cliff to look over it. So the more careful ones survived, and what they tended to also pass on in their genes to their successors were these fears of certain things. And that's why we think through natural selection, that's why some of us today have those fears, because at one point they increased our chances of surviving. Yes, ma'am?
Okay, so are they concerned with like the genetics of
No, this has nothing to do with genetics, except to the point that it's built into our genes
Okay.
somewhere.
So this isn't like, this is separate than like the biological.
Except, yeah, think of this clearly as evolutionary, okay? Yeah, when we get to biology, we'll talk about, to use your example, we certainly think that most psychological disorders like depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, they all have a genetic basis in the sense that if you happen to inherit a certain set of genes, you're going to be biologically predisposed to develop one of those disorders. Not necessarily a done deal, because what we're going to stress in those chapters is an interaction between genetics and your environment. Not everybody who develops a biological predisposition for alcoholism becomes an alcoholic if they don't expose themselves to a lot of alcohol. So again, it's an interaction. But that's a different, that's a great question. Okay, any other questions about the evolutionary perspective? Okay. Now this is a term you should be aware of because it's very popular in people's approach to psychology today, and that is eclecticism. Does anybody know what it means if somebody describes themselves as an eclectic? Okay. It basically means that it's recognizing this point here that a one-size-fits-all approach usually does not work with human beings because we're too darn complicated. You guys are the most complicated organism in the universe. You have tremendous variability in your personalities. And you see I've given you the definition of personality there. The individual's unique, relatively consistent patterns of thinking, feeling, and behavior. It's basically, again, how you approach the world. But since one explanation for personality, for instance, doesn't usually work, therapists today take what we call an eclectic approach, which allows them to pick and choose from techniques, from theories, depending on the client's personality and the problem or problems being presented. So somebody who describes themselves as an eclectic therapist, when a patient comes in, presents their problem, they decide from a toolkit of potential techniques to use to match up the technique with the person's problem and the personality that they bring to therapy. And interestingly, statistically, this is how the largest group of clinicians today describe themselves. So what I was describing in myself, I describe myself as a cognitive behaviorist. Well, that's somewhat eclectic. Basically what I'm saying is one single approach doesn't do the trick. So I tend to borrow from two perspectives. Now I could also borrow from a third or fourth perspective, and that would make me even more eclectic. Okay? Everybody see that? So know what eclecticism is. Okay, another interesting question when you get into psychology is what's the difference between a clinical psychologist and a psychiatrist? Anybody want to answer that before you read the slide? Yeah.
Can't one prescribe medicine?
Yes, exactly. One, that being the psychiatrist, can prescribe medication because as you see here in the right-hand column, psychiatrists have medical degrees, either a doctor of medicine or a doctor of osteopathy. Those are special kinds of medical schools.
So what is that second one?
Doctor of osteopathy?
Yeah.
It's just an approach to medicine that tends to stress structure in the body, bone structure as being important. Yes.
So could you like basically define a psychiatrist as a psychologist plus medicine use?
Yeah, they've got additional medical training in the diagnosis, treatment, causes, and prevention of psychological disorders. And because of that emphasis on medicine, it tends to influence then how they practice psychiatry. And that's the second bullet point there. So they emphasize biological factors and use biomedical therapy. What's the most obvious biomedical therapy? If you go to a psychiatrist, what are you likely to come out of their office with? What's that? A prescription for medication for depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, whatever. Okay? Now there are other biomedical therapies as well that we will mention. One of them being one that's kind of finding a resurgence today in psychiatry, and that is electroconvulsive therapy. Anybody know what ECT is? ECT is it's old shock therapy, where they actually will hook up electrodes on the person's skull and induce a convulsion. That's electroconvulsive therapy. So basically what it does is, I think of it kind of grossly as like you do with a computer. Your computer is acting goofy, sometimes you just reboot it. Turn it off, turn it back on. To kind of straighten things out.
So is it actually effective?
It is effective in about 2/3 of people that get ECT. Now we don't use ECT as a first resort because there's a significant adverse side effect from ECT. Does anybody know what it is?
Paralysis?
Not paralysis, memory loss. Memory loss. Because again, it scrambles your brain chemistry somewhat, and that brain chemistry we know, and we'll see this in chapter 6, is involved in the formation of memories, like we talked about yesterday. So there's some memory loss. So what ECT is reserved for, the patients it's reserved for typically, are patients who have not responded well to some medication, or people who are very suicidal in their thinking. If you've ever had any experience with antidepressant medications, you know that it takes 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 weeks for antidepressants to build up in your system to get to what we call therapeutic levels. And if somebody is suicidal right now, we don't have the luxury of waiting 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. So for those patients, we may consider electroconvulsive therapy, get in there right away and get an effect. Okay? But that's another kind of biomedical therapy that a psychiatrist would have to get additional training. Okay? Now me, in the left-hand column as a clinical psychologist, I also was trained in the diagnosis, treatment, causes, and prevention of psychological disorders. I have a PhD. There's also a doctorate called a PsyD, a doctorate of psychology. And we engage in the practice of psychotherapy, counseling, or talk therapy to assist clients. I sit down with you and I talk about what's going on in your life. I make suggestions. I give you ideas of how to do things differently. But I can't prescribe the medication. If I have, for instance, a patient that I'm working with who is depressed, and I think they could benefit from an antidepressant, I have to make a referral either to a psychiatrist, or nowadays, prescriptions for antidepressants are so ubiquitous everywhere. A lot of family practice physicians will feel comfortable prescribing an antidepressant. But I've got to go to an MD for that. Also, if I have a patient who I think needs to be hospitalized because they're, for instance, maybe suicidal, I have to go through an MD because most PhDs don't have admitting privileges in hospitals. Now, there are 2 states in the country, New Mexico, I think it's New Mexico, and Louisiana, where a clinical psychologist with some additional training can also be allowed to prescribe certain medication, psychotropic medication. And that's because those are 2 very sparsely populated states. So there might be people out in rural areas who need to benefit from medication, but they can't get to a psychiatrist, so maybe there'll be a psychologist available to prescribe medication. Okay? Any questions about the differences between clinical psychologists and psychiatrists? Okay. This is a slide that gives you some of those different specialty areas within psychology. You see the largest group there at the top, clinical psychologists. That would be the group that I'm in. And we have counseling psychologists. So if you add those 2 groups together, you see it's about 49% of psychologists do counseling, do psychotherapy. Then you have the smaller groups, social psychologists, neuropsychologists, biological psychologists, cognitive psychologists, industrial organizations, developmental school, etc. Those, now you're getting into the specialties. And over on the right are the settings in which a lot of these psychologists would work. Self-employment. If I weren't teaching, for instance, I might have a full-time private practice. I would be self-employed there. I would fall into that. I would really fall into those first 2 groups because I'm working at a university, but I also have a part-time private practice. Okay? Any questions? Okay, now the rest of the chapter is going to focus on what kinds of